This program is about unsolved mysteries. Whenever possible, the actual family members and police officials have participated in recreating the events. What you're about to see is not a news broadcast.
In a world where faith's chosen have ascended to the heavens, and those truly terrible and guilty of heinous crimes of sin have been sent to the underworld, only you remain, the meek who have inherited the world. Hi, Brandon.
Hi, Josh. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Goblins and Growlers podcast.
I'm Josh at Black Cloak DM on Twitter.
And I'm Brandon at Way of Brandalore on Twitter, feeling very depressed because I've done a lot of reading on our topic today.
I was going to say, I think the bleakness that you're bringing to the table is a really strong indicator of just how, fun-loving and positive this game that we're going to be talking about today is.
Oh, I am at maximum Eeyore right now. I'm Eeyore up to 11 after reading this.
I saw a review on the Wikipedia page that said, after an afternoon of this game, I needed an evening of Barney reruns to get myself back to a spiritual balance.
Well, on that cheerful note, everybody, today on the Goblins and Growlers podcast, we're talking about 1995's The End, a game about the end of the world, the Rapture, the apocalypse, all that stuff. Four Horsemen and everything.
Oh my god. Written by Scapegoat Games, who both of us tried to find literally any other games, productions, hobbyist reproductions, anything about, and literally came up empty-handed.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure The End was the only thing they published. I think I found some references on some maybe 10, 15-year-old forums posts indicating that this might have been the only thing that they published.
They have the judge screen, which comes up on things like Board Game Geek, but it's for The End, so...
Right. So, what is The End? It is its own role-playing system, and it is very much a niche product. I think that's a good way to put it. The whole premise of the game, for anybody unfamiliar, is it is set after the Rapture and Christian apocalypse, where and sort of the nut graph of the whole thing is the meek shall inherit the earth was a warning, not a promise, because God decides that it's time for the Rapture, everything's over. Really terrible, awful, heinous people go to hell. The righteous get raptured to heaven. And then there's the meek. It's people who weren't bad enough for hell, but they weren't righteous enough for heaven. So they get left behind on Earth, essentially.
As I understand it, traditionally, people who do things not good enough for heaven, but not bad enough for hell, historically end up in limbo, which is basically a big nothingness space where you have to do a little more navigating before it's determined where you're going to go. So we are literally making Earth limbo.
I mean, that reading depends on your denomination. It depends sort of where you're coming at it from, because there's a lot of different belief structures out there under the umbrella of Christendom.
I will not at any point during this episode pretend that I am a theologian. I am not, and I will not assume that I am.
Yeah. But so anyways, the setup for the game is told through a story about a guy who is one of the ones left behind. He essentially wakes up one day, his wife and daughter are gone. He seems to be the only person left in his town. And sort of Omega Man style, he's going around trying to figure out what to do. He hangs around the house for a while. The way that God has kind of announced what's happened to everybody is through a dream. everybody has the same dream, like all the meek, that is, have the same dream days and days and days and days in a row, where they're standing in line at the gates with friends and family, and they'll see somebody in front of them who maybe they know is not one of the best people, and they'll see them get dragged down to hell, and they'll see people who they know are, good, be allowed into heaven. Like the protagonist in the intro story, for example, he sees his wife and daughter be accepted into heaven, and then he just kind of wakes up. And the way in the lore of the game, that is essentially God's final message to humanity, because the worthy are getting into heaven, the damned are going to hell, and he's shutting the gates, and you're on your own now. So basically, God's one, proving he exists, two, telling everybody who's left behind, you can have it. It's up to you now. You figure out how to survive. So it is a post-apocalyptic world, and we'll dig into that a little bit more as we talk about it. But one of the important things to remember here is God has abandoned Earth. And that has a lot of implications to it. First and foremost, there's no afterlife anymore. There's no, like, if somebody on Earth at this point, if one of the meek dies, your soul doesn't go anywhere. It has nowhere to go. The gates to hell are closed. The gates to heaven are closed. So you just die. So there's no afterlife. So that also means there's no sin, since there's no threat of punishment or enticement of reward. So once people start realizing this, everything just goes bonkers. With, like, you see things like slavery comes back in certain parts of the country, cannibalism. Everybody just essentially starts going feral. Man no longer has mastery over the beasts, because that was a gift from God. So animals are becoming more wild. They're becoming they're no longer afraid of humans, basically. So they'll come out of the mountains and everything and attack people. The only animals that are still showing any kind of loyalty to humans are dogs. So you could, if you have a dog with you for protection, that's pretty valuable. Vast swaths of the country are completely uninhabited. You could go for days and days and not see another person. But there are Mad Max style raiding parties at a certain point. It's just a complete hellscape, basically, from the perspective of a civilized person in modern society. And also, man-made things are starting to rot at an accelerated rate. Like, bridges are being overrun with rust in a matter of months or years, whereas normally it would take decades for something like that to happen. Essentially, nature is reclaiming the earth, and if something isn't being used regularly, it just starts to decay. Immediately, you're in a sort of hopeless world. Your supplies are limited. There is very little civilization to speak of. And that's the world we find ourselves in the end. I have read this book. It is a depressing book. Like, that reviewer was not very far off the mark, because I was reading this, I'm like, oh man. Because another part of the story is it talks about the 7 seals of the apocalypse and everything, and how the Four Horsemen sort of inflicted themselves on the world, and it does it through news accounts. Like, there was pestilence.
Oh, God.
Pestilence is like some sort of, or no, famine is the problem with the soil. Pestilence is the disease that was cooked up in a lab. There's just a lot to unpack here. I'm not going to go through all of it because it's all depressing. But anyways, the point is, you just sort of travel through this world, going to these settlements that are trying to hold on to sort of the last embers of civilization and restore them. And that's where we are. The Four Horsemen still roam the countryside. There are new beasts, like Old Testament style beasts, that roam the country as well. And this is pretty much set in North America. I think there were plans for this to release other supplements that would deal with other parts of the world, but since this was the only thing that Scapegoat Games ever released, if I'm correct about that, we just never saw that.
It does make me wonder if there's some sort of like nearly final draft sitting on someone's shelf that's been play tested and just never got published.
Like that Star Fox sequel.
Yes, exactly like that Star Fox sequel.
Yeah, that you can actually buy from unreputable dealers. Probably the most notable thing about this game is that it was banned from GenCon back in the 90s. And this was back when TSR, I think, owned GenCon. And this was like legitimate old TSR, not this new TSR from Ernie Gygax. But they had a rule, apparently, against games with lots of religious themes or imagery. Scapegoat had this. They got kicked out. And they ended up doing sort of a faux protest outside of Gen Con with like sandwich boards that were like, the end is here. Trying to be like the street prophet. Apparently, all it ended up doing was generating a little bit more buzz for them. But obviously, it didn't translate into sales to keep anything going. And I really wish I could find some more information about Scapegoat Games. Probably the most interesting thing about this whole situation is the absolute dearth of information that's out there about the people behind it, the company, even like stories about the controversy and the ban at Gen Con. It's very difficult to find information about this. Like Evil Hat, who publishes Fate, they put out a book that was essentially the history of tabletop role-playing in like 2014. And there's a passing mention of this, of the Gen Con controversy for the end. But that's about it. Like, I went all over forums everywhere for weeks trying to find more information about this because, like I can read the book and I can tell you what's in the book, but I wanted to try and learn a little bit more about the story behind it. Like, how did this come up? Where did the ideas come from? What made the author want to write this? I couldn't find anything. It was amazing to me.
Well, it's almost like there was the Gen Con controversy and then that was all they did in the first place. Like that's it. Like at that point they dissolved the entity. They all went back to their day jobs,
Yeah. And I'll say like I didn't do maybe as much digging as I could have just because time is finite in my life. But I don't know what else I could have done short of, searching for corporation registrations in, I think it was like Wisconsin or Minnesota, wherever this company was headquartered, just trying to find out, when they registered their LLC, when it dissolved. There's just no information. The primary writer, I think there were several people who wrote on it, but sort of the primary creative on this was a man named Joseph Donka. And I really tried to find out anything I could about him. I was like, well, he put out an RPG sourcebook in the 90s. I bet he still stayed involved in the RPG scene for a while, and I can probably find some stuff. Couldn't find anything. It's almost like he never wrote anything else again. I see some passing mentions to maybe him contributing to something, but I can never get the title of it. Whether it was, I don't know if it was maybe some sort of short adventure or something. I don't know. Couldn't find it. I think I may have found him on social media in a couple places, and I even reached out to him, but I couldn't get an answer. I think at last check, my message is still on unread, which doesn't surprise me because he would probably be in his mid 50s, early 60s at this point, and he may just not be somebody who's tied into their social media pretty closely, which is totally fair. But believe me, I tried reasonably hard to get a hold of this person, to get them on the podcast, to interview them about this. And I'm not going to give up on that. But I really just wanted to get the story behind this. And it's just boggling to me that in this age where you can find out almost anything on the internet if you look hard enough, that I really couldn't get any more information about how this came about.
I mean, it almost strikes me as one of those situations where you have something that comes out and, the classic success story of these places is, oh, well, they were a group of friends and they got together in so-and-so's basement and they were playing games together. And one day they were like, we could do this. Like, I have an idea for something. We could build it out. And, they started building it out. And then now today it's this huge juggernaut machine. Well, obviously not every story is going to go like that. And I think the only reason we even know this group is still around is probably because of the GenCon controversy and the buzz that surrounded that. Because I have to imagine that there's plenty of folks who go out there, they take their shot, it doesn't go like they wanted it to, and they're like, you know what? This was a lot more work than I thought it was going to be when I started all of this. I was anticipating way more fun than I got out of all of this.
Yeah.
Because I know when we started Goblins and Growlers, we were like, this is going to be great. This is going to be so much fun. And while it is great and it is a ton of fun, we also learned it is a ridiculous amount of work.
Yeah, business ownership is hard. And creative business ownership is really hard. Especially if you're doing a lot of the content creation on top of trying to run the business.
Yeah.
But like I said, I think I found this guy, and I'm not going to give out like too much information about what I found because I, don't want to dox him or anything like that.
I was going to say, please don't dox anyone on our podcast.
Yeah, please don't. Because if dude doesn't want to be found or talked to, let him live in peace. I just reached out with like hey, here's who I am and what I'm doing. Would love to talk to you about this if you want to. If not, I totally understand. But I'm pretty confident it's him. I'm just of the impression that he has sort of left this life behind. Not in a the end way, but in a I've moved on with my life kind of way.
Well, now something that I know because you and I have discussed this a little bit already, and then we were putting together the show notes, kind of discussing things, is that one of the people who worked on the end has done a significant catalog of other work.
Yeah. One of the, really the way that I found out about this at all is I was on Reddit poking around for weird RPG systems. I was really just kind of looking for something different. I do that every once in a while, especially when we're kicking around topic ideas for the show. And I found this, the description was something to the effect of, Christian apocalypse role-playing game. I was like, oh, well, this, if nothing else, this sounds like it'll be interesting to read. And one of the things that really took me about it was I saw a picture of the cover, and we'll put this in the notes, but it was really evocative to me of the Planescape art from the 90s when the Planescape setting came out. Just sort of muted colors. You'd see a lot of geometry in the art. There's blues and browns and some golds and things like that. And I was like, oh, that looks a lot like Planescape. I wonder, just because the timing would have worked out, I wonder if the same artist who did that did Planescape. And I was wrong, but I wasn't far off.
Yeah, finding out that this artist, who, let me grab his name again because I'm terrible with names.
Richard Kane Ferguson.
Richard Kane Ferguson did a lot of illustrating on Magic the Gathering cards. And I mean a lot of Magic the Gathering cards.
Yeah.
I was just scrolling through his Instagram and there are dozens of cards in there that he did the illustrations for.
Yeah, his work seems like it focuses a lot on sort of dark fantasy stuff. I found a little item about him where just in 2021, the original oil and acrylic he did for Daikon Shadow Slayer, which I presume is a Magic card. I'm not super into Magic, but the gist I got from reading this was that it was the illustration for a Magic card, but this was the original oil and acrylic that he did for it. It sold for $31,000, which is amazing.
It's pretty phenomenal. That is, I don't think there are many Magic cards that you can sell for that kind of money, and Magic has a much larger on average following with a much deeper well of pockets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So, this guy is a professional artist, and he was a successful professional artist back then. So it wasn't just sort of a fly by night thing, the way this came together, which makes essentially the rapture of information, all information about this book, all the more strange. I want to talk a little bit about the setting some more, because I had a thought while I was reading this. We talked about how it's a scarcity environment, it's post-apocalyptic, civilization is kind of scattered and only exists in little cells here and there. And the whole time I'm reading it, I'm thinking of The Walking Dead, because it's essentially the wider Walking Dead universe has sort of evolved into this, where we're well aware that there's a wider world out there, but there are only pockets of civilization that largely are unconnected. And I got to thinking that let's set aside all the religious connotations for a minute, because no matter what you believe, you have to believe that hurt it. In the 90s, we were not so far away from the scare about Dungeons and Dragons like we are now. Like, it's a lot easier for, I think, adults now to sort of laugh at that. But even in the 90s, I think there was still some lingering feelings about that, especially from really, really conservative people. So set aside all the religious stuff about this. If you put that aside, it's almost like this game came along about 20 or 30 years too early. If this had been coincident maybe with when Kirkman's Walking Dead was really catching fire, I feel like this is a natural dovetail that could have propelled it to maybe a bit of a more prominent spot in the general RPG canon. Like, was it just before its time? Was that one of the big knocks against it?
Well, and it's one of those situations where it's entirely possible that had they produced it in a time when post-apocalypse media was more popular, then they could have gotten, a peer group or someone like that to pull them aside and be like, hey, like the religious overtones, they're maybe a little too strong, like play those down a little bit more and play this up a little bit more and then rebrand it like this. And then all of a sudden they would have had a bombshell on their hand. Like, it's impossible to say. The other question that raises is, was this, like, yes, too early, but was it a indicator of things to come? Like, was this the light in the distance to be like, the post-apocalypse wave is coming?
I mean, it's not that there were no other popular post-apocalyptic media out there back then.
Well, we had, like, Mad Max.
Yeah, you had Mad Max. Omega Man was, popular. It wasn't, like, groundbreakingly popular, but, it was popular. Planet of the Apes, like, you boil everything else away, that's a post-apocalyptic film. But also, it had its own particular hook that wasn't one of the dominant faiths on Earth. Yeah, maybe it's not necessarily that. Maybe it's the grittiness of this post-apocalyptic work, because it's much more in line with the kind of stuff you see on The Walking Dead versus sort of the essentially cartoon violence of stuff like Planet of the Apes. Because the story I was telling about the intro to the book and how it goes through the life of that guy whose life changed, like, he basically turns into Daryl Dixon by the time it's over. So he's taking on, he goes from being like an accountant to being able to take on bands of raiders and stuff like that and protect people, becomes somebody who's well known sort of throughout the connected world. Because that's another thing. It very much treats it like the Old West, which you see a lot in post-apocalyptic literature, how everything sort of devolves into that, where, like, there are so few people left that your reputation can be carried kind of wide and far just on a few stories. So he becomes that, sort of the archetype of the new survivor, like a Rick Grimes or a Daryl Dixon, essentially. And I really do think, the more I've thought about it for a few days now, and the more I think about it, is like, if this came out, maybe not now because the TTRPG market is just so flooded right now. There's just so much from so many different genres. But if this came out maybe like 10 or 15 years later, so it came out in 95, so we were talking about 2005, 2010, I think it could have at least sparked an ember that would have kept burning until now. And there was a second edition revival attempt at this in like the late 90s, early 2000s from another outfit called Tyranny Games, which looks like they purchased the rights to this, or perhaps it was the same group of people who reincorporated under another company. Again, I cannot find information about it. They also appeared defunct at this point because I did some looking there as well. And if anybody else can prove me wrong on this or can find some other information, please tell me, because I feel like I did my due diligence trying to find this information and it's just not there. But they did a second edition revival for the end. They had a few more releases. It looks like they released maybe 3 or 4 books for it. Really, the only concrete information I could find for that was somebody who wrote a review of it and was very sort of laudatory, but they also had a disclaimer in the review that's like, hey, I was a big fan of the original release of this system, and I know I'm writing kind of a glowing review on this, but I just want to be upfront with you that I'm also hoping that I can do some writing for this system. And it seems like this just sort of faded away over the course of a few years, because the references I found show that the second edition maybe started up in 99, and maybe by 2002, 2003, it also had disappeared, following suit with its predecessor. But, maybe they just missed the boat. Maybe, like I said, maybe if this comes out in like the 2010s, when Walking Dead is really getting popular and making that leap from comic books to AMC, something like this, riding those kind of post-apocalyptic coattails, play down the religious aspects of it, maybe keep them in there, but don't make them so much the focus. And then it would have had more of a chance. But as a creative, I can also understand the counter argument of, well, if you take that away from it and downplay it, then what is it? It's not my vision anymore. So win or lose on this, the one thing I can respect, and I think anybody who engages in any kind of creative work, no matter how you feel about how they're talking about Christianity or anything like that, when somebody has a vision and they take that big swing to put it together, and they get so far as they're producing this, 170 page source book with professional art and everything like that, like, you have to stand up and applaud that, because they put in the work. You may not like it, you may not agree with it, but you gotta love that they put the work in. I will never run this game. Not because I have any objections to the content or anything like that. It's just a little too much of a downer for me. So I don't think I would ever put the effort into running it. Just as a thing that exists that I'm going to keep on my shelf, because I actually managed to find a softcover copy of it for like $7, which I'm kind of amazed about, because I just looked for some the other day, like 2 months after I ordered this, and they're much more expensive now. But that I have this, I'm glad that I have it, because it represents somebody who had a vision that they put the time and effort into executing. And no matter what else you can say, they were successful at putting it out there to let people decide if they wanted it or not.
So I had missed that you found a revival under Tyranny Games. So I did a little bit of digging on Tyranny Games, and guess who pops back up? It's your boy, Joseph Donka, who actually works on a expansion for the end called The End Exodus, which is kind of a continuation story for people who have played The End and had successful runs. And that came out in 2005. So it's interesting to see that, like, they took their initial swing in the mid-90s, and then it goes dark for a while, and then at the very least Joseph Donka and Joseph E. Tierney both pop up and produce a couple more modules and things like that for the end. They produce a system called Cults and Conspiracies. Oh, I'm sorry, that is an expansion for Of Gods and Men. Mm-hmm. And all of that is available on DriveThruRPG. So I was like, well, surely they have a website. Well, they did have a website. It was tyrannygames.com. And that now is a Chinese football
Yes.
website.
I found that when I was looking. That's why I was saying that I was pretty sure that the company was defunct, because their web address is now a Chinese football website. Looking in the actual credits for the first edition of The End, I don't see Joseph Tierney anywhere. So what I suspect might have happened is maybe he was somebody who enjoyed The End. He approached Donka about, let's try it again. And then they partnered to try and do something else with the IP. I have nothing to base that on other than just my suspicions. But that makes sense, since one of them's listed in the original and one of them's not. And, Joe Donka is the creator and writer of all this.
I just thought it was interesting that I was able to find Tyranny Games at least a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm looking at the credits page on this, and it also has some disclaimers and stuff, which I'd read but have sort of forgotten about. And it's really long, but essentially it's like, The End's a work of fiction. Any similarity between characters and events portrayed in this book and any real persons, living or dead, purely coincidental, wishful thinking on behalf of some lawsuit-hungry party. The premise of The End is based on Judeo-Christian apocalypse stories. This does not represent a religious statement on behalf of the management of Scapegoat Games, nor is it meant as a religious treatise. It's just a game, folks. This is only a game. If at any time what happens while playing The End becomes more important than reality, seek competent psychiatric help. I think that might have been meant to address, perhaps, people who would criticize the game, in addition to people going a little hardcore in it. Due to the subject matter and artistic content of The End, the product should be used only by those individuals mature enough to handle it. We recommend a minimum age of 17 be required before playing. And all biblical quotes, as well as chapter and verse notations, come from the King James Version of the Bible. So I think that was probably their attempt to get in front of what they expected in terms of criticism, I think. Which is probably wise.
Yeah, well, and I don't blame them for trying to get out ahead of that. It does... I don't know. There are two ways to read the whole, like, if this is getting you too worked up, you might need to seek professional help. And one of those is the favorable, like, hey, like, take care of yourself. Don't do this if you're in a rough emotional space, or if this is a little too rough for you. The flip side of that is I've known altogether too many people who will be like, oh, well, if it's so distressing for you, maybe you need... And it's like, I hope it's not the latter.
Yeah.
But it's impossible to say, because text has no tone. What I can say is that doing a little more sleuthing on Tyranny Games, I did find a mailing address, which, again, I'm not going to dox anything here, but I suspect people who do the same sort of sleuthing I did may also come across it, which, I don't know, maybe you could send a postcard and be like, hey, is this still Tyranny Games?
Yeah, I guess you could.
So something I will say is that Joseph Tierney, at the very least, was active at forums when they were advertising the return of The End.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those posts are still up, talking about, like, hey, here's what you can expect from the new stuff we're producing. Here's some of the other things that we've got licenses for. Like, they talk about the role-playing game of Gods and Men. They also talk about something called Sack Army's Expeditionary Force. And then they talk about anticipating the release of their newest boardless board game, Colonization, which I think I definitely want to read a little bit more about, but I don't want to take too much of the heat that we have gathered from The End.
Right.
So if we dig into that and we find a nugget of delicious, sweet material, then maybe we can make that a future episode.
So maybe the thing to do, if we are trying to track down the creative team on this and get some more information, since we've sort of run into a dead end with Joe Donka, if the guy that I'm pretty sure is him won't respond to me, maybe we reach out to Joseph Tierney and see if we can't get our foot in the door that way.
Yeah, which, as we say the word tyranny multiple times because it's Tyranny Games, and as we say the last name Tierney, it occurs to me that Tyranny Games is just because his last name is Tierney.
Yeah. Yeah. I kind of feel a little dumb there that I didn't think of that. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But yeah, like I feel like he has to be. We're turning this into a true crime podcast now. Like I feel like he has to be. He had to have come into the picture later, approached the original creator, and said, "Hey, let's do something with this. Do you want to work together?" And then they put out some stuff, and it didn't work out.
I wouldn't completely rule out the possibility that the two of them already knew each other, and this was just a situation where Joseph Tierney was like, hey, you know what? Like, I want to license these games and I want to print them and publish them, and we can do more of the end stuff, and we can work on some new original stuff as well. And Joseph Donka was like, hell yeah, let's do this. Like, I don't want to paint too bold of a picture when you and I are basically like picking up the barest newspaper clippings and trying to establish a complete picture out of them.
Yeah, I'll speak for yourself. I've got a bunch of note cards on my wall with string going from one to the other to the other. Yeah, like I didn't dive so deep into it that I was analyzing the names of the posters who were posting this stuff. So, that's on me just doing it with my part-time research there. But yeah, I mean, it sounds like now we might actually be able to reach out to somebody who we would have a decent chance of talking to about something.
I mean, at the very least, it seemed like, because I have yet to see anything that indicates that Joseph Donka was ever like reaching out to the public, doing like marketing materials or anything like that. Where Joseph Tierney, at the very least, we know is more comfortable with the concept of being out in a public space, talking about the marketing of new materials and things like that. Mm-hmm. So maybe if we can find some sort of social media for Joseph Tierney, which, by the way, listeners, there's no guarantee that we find that between now and release time. So if you find that and you want to tweet it at us or send it in an email or literally like smoke signals, like we don't get us that information, that might be very useful for us.
I really do want to turn this into a podcast series where we track down the creators and actually have a fulsome interview with them about this setting and everything. Because again, right before we got into this talk about Tierney, like I was sort of going off on my usual rant of like respect creators because they're putting themselves out there and everything. Like that's what I want to talk about. I just like, hey, this is a pretty bold move that you made for the time, trying to put this out there. And, I just want to hear the story of how it came about and what was the genesis, pardon the pun, of this idea for you.
Yeah, it'd be really interesting to kind of get their perspective on not just the production of the game, but also, how was it received from the perspective of the creator? Because I know, like, our books, the stuff that we sell, is reasonably well accepted and folks seem to enjoy it. But I know for me personally, anytime I like flip open one of the books, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember this adventure. Oh yeah, I also remember like this is before I realized this and this about monster creation. And so like the numbers are wonky compared to how I would do it now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had planned originally on ending this episode by us both just sort of talking about our favorite post-apocalyptic stories. But I think you, in a very good turn, have twisted this into more the opening salvo of a mystery that we're going to have to solve and track down and get a hold of somebody so we can learn a little bit more about this and share that with listeners and stuff. I would encourage anybody who is even mildly interested in what we're talking about to try to get their hands on a copy of The End. Like I said, there are two versions of it. There's the original one that came out in the mid-90s, and then there's the revival that Tierney was involved with that was more like 99 through 2003, 2005, something like that. So try to be sure which one you're buying. If you look for the one with the cover that looks kind of like a Planescape game, you'll know the one I'm talking about. But I found mine on abebooks.com, which is sort of my go-to for like weird used books that I can't find anywhere locally. So I would check that out as my first place if you wanted to get it. Like, I bought mine for like $8 or $9 or something like that. I think they're coming up a little bit more expensive on there now, but if nothing else, as a curiosity, I think it's worth it.
I would say also, if you're going to be checking out like some of the work that surrounds this piece, you should go look at Robert Kane Ferguson's Instagram. Did I get his name right?
Yeah.
Yes.
No. Richard Kane Ferguson. Richard Kane Ferguson.
No. So this is if you ever needed evidence that I'm genuinely really bad at names, like, it's right here, and it's just that I'm bad at remembering them. Richard Kane Ferguson. Check out his Instagram, which is just instagram.com/rkaneferguson, because the art he does is really cool.
Yeah, it's full of cool stuff.
Like it.
It's totally full of cool stuff. This is, I like to think, the first in a multi-chapter Goblins and Growlers investigation of The End and Scapegoat Games. Maybe we can have our own Netflix doc on this by the time it's done.
Well, my sincerest hope is that chapter 2 is not us coming back and being like, so we got a hold of some of the people who were creators and they told us to leave them alone.
Fair. That can be a news item at the top of the next podcast. But anyways, folks, thanks for listening. This turned into something different than what we planned when we were talking about recording it, but I'm very happy with where it landed, and it's given us some purpose in trying to push this storyline on a little bit. Josh, do you have anything more you want to add?
I just want to say that this is one of my favorite pieces of you and I doing this show, is the occasions where we're just kind of jawing back and forth, and then one of us is like, light bulb.
I'll tell you this too. We cut out a good bit of this podcast because we had some side conversations about how to go about the investigation and where to look on some stuff.
If it sounds weird when we cut back in, that's probably why. Hopefully it doesn't. Hopefully we're better editors than that, but I don't know.
All right. Well, if anybody has any leads, you can tweet them at me at Way of Brandalore on Twitter.
Or you can tweet them at me at BlackCloakDM on Twitter.
Or, you could email them to contact@goblinsandgrowlers.com, subject line, The End Mystery. But in the meantime, thanks for listening to the Goblins and Growlers podcast. Please support us as you can. If nothing else, please tell a friend about it. I'm Brandon Dingus.
If you can give us a review on something like Apple Podcasts, that helps us out and costs you nothing. It costs you nothing. I'm Josh Malting.
Thanks, everybody. We'll catch you next time.
Bye, y'all.
Perhaps you may be able to help solve a mystery.